Hello, Charlotte from Leeds. We have Jim Dickinson. Hello, Matt. Hello, Lincoln SU. We'll give people a few minutes to join us. People are always a bit late to the first session of a conference. Welcome to Montfort Students' Union. We might be able to do free virtual coffee, but I think that's as good as we can do. Hello, Josephine. Helen says, hello, Gurnham. Paul Allender says hi.
Oh, hi, Paul. Paul and I used to play football together, but intellectual and actual.
Morning, Max from Aston in sunny Birmingham. Morning, Bath Spa Students' Union.
Sounds like Eurovision Song Contest. Bath Spa University, give us your scores. Maybe that's how we should evaluate this talk.
In the Student Union sector, Gurnham, there is an awful lot of love for the Eurovision Song Contest. I think that's tweeted about as much as sector news.
Yeah, well, you have to give me a minute to get into my other costume then.
Welcome to Scotland as well. We have Aberdeen. Hello, Louise at Aberdeen. Okay, I think we'll get started. Very big thank you for joining us this morning. My name is John Abel and I'm the Chief Executive at Coventry University Students' Union, who are hosting SU20 Digital. Joining us for our first session of the week, we have Dr. Gurnham Singh, who works here as Associate Professor of Equity Attainment at Coventry University. Dr. Singh is also Associate Professor of Sociology at the University of Warwick, up the road. He is the Visiting Professor of Social Work at University of Chester, and Gurnham is also a Visiting Professor in Race and Education at the University of Arts, London. We thought it really important with our choice of first session for the conference that we had something pretty hard-hitting for all of us. And in particular, I think this will be a difficult session for some, because obviously there will be mention of George Ford's death and what happened in America and the Black Lives Matter movement and how that is impacting higher education. There will be difficult things for us to hear, but very necessary things for us to hear. And it is very grateful that Gurnham could join us today to present. So over to Gurnham. This session is recorded. As Gurnham is talking, please put your questions in the question and answer area of Zoom. I will collect those and I will put them to Gurnham at the end of the session. But now over to Gurnham.
Thank you, John, for that introduction, and you know, good morning to everybody. I'm told that there's up to 500 people actually joining us this morning, so it feels like a great privilege to be speaking. But it is an important moment in history, and hopefully that over the next half an hour or so, I can try and project some of the kind of importance that there is, and you know what we can do about it. But the title of the talk is Decolonising the University. What does this mean for white people? Of course, you know, conversations about decolonising are not new. You know, they go back at least 20, 25 years. But there's something really significant about the moment that we're in at the now. And so I'm very much kind of using the backdrop of Black Lives Matter movement and the public execution of George Floyd by the Minneapolis police, But there's also the global COVID-19 pandemic and how that's having a disproportionate impact on Black and ethnic minority communities and on indigenous people across the world. We shouldn't forget that. You know, when we have these kinds of viruses or these diseases, it's often indigenous people, the people who have no access to healthcare, that suffer the most. So it's given us kind of new impetus really to think about the whole question about, you know, institutional racism in society, but within universities as well. I think the trashing of the statue of the slave trader, Edward Colston, and the supplanting of that with a statue of Jen Reid, a local Black Lives activist, matters activist, has re-energized the debate around decolonizing and the role of the university. And symbolic moments like these are important as they motivate people to act. But we need to begin to dismantle both the racist myths that we harbor in our minds, but also in the everyday practices of institutions, and which might be beyond our immediate control, but we still need to think about how we can engage with those. Though the demand for anti-racist education, as I say, and decolonization is not new, the data on BAME deaths, on police brutality, on war, conflict, refugee movements, etc. I think we can agree that reflections on how centuries of white privilege and colonialism within the UK continue to impact on communities racialized as not white and other has seen a significant amplification, I think, in recent times. And in the past, problems faced by BAME communities have tended to be explained away through racialized tropes and cultural pathology. And these associated narratives that have painted a picture of non-white people, of Black people, if you like, BAME communities or people of color, as being inherently and even genetically predisposed to morbidity, mortality, educational failure, criminality, and so on. However, there is also now considerable momentum to confront such explanatory frameworks and associated mindsets by focusing on structural racism and its entrenchment within our organizations. And to do this, it's not enough simply to see the problem as one requiring a technical fix or a slight adjustment here and there in a neoliberal sense. I don't know if anybody notices, but even framing the issues as a problem runs the risk of falling into old racist tropes associated with the Black problem, the immigration problem, the refugee problem, and so on. So let me reframe. The only way we can begin to challenge is to understand how the historical antecedents to, for example, the deep levels of conscious and unconscious bias and implicit association of non-white people as the problematic other. To do this, we must delve into the history of colonialism and how this has laid down the foundations for the kinds of racialized thoughts and practices and structures that we experience today. And so the aim of my session is to raise some challenges and possible ways forward for confronting institutionalized racism. And of course, you know, decolonizing the university is a key aspect of that. I'm going to go on to the next slide. It's just a word of caution here. There are some distressing images. I'm going to have an image of the execution of George Floyd. So if you feel that that's going to be disturbing, then please look away or blank your screen or whatever. Yeah. Let's see. So I'll try to put together a number of pictures here, try to link them all. So if we begin to think about, I mean, the one on the right there, the execution of George Floyd, I don't think anything more needs to be said about that. But I think it's interesting, if we look at the image next to George Floyd here, this is an image taken from the Order of St. Michael and St. George's, which is a badge, which is like a medal that's traditionally bestowed by the Queen on ambassadors, diplomats, and senior foreign office officials. And you can see this uncanny, similarity. Here's a picture of an angel, clearly representing European or British white supremacy, and a Black person there, with clearly almost an identical image to the one that we saw with George Floyd. And just this last week, we saw again, this happening. I think it's on the streets of London, where there was an arrest of a Black guy by police officers, and again, it was captured on video with them having the knee on his neck. If we look at the one on the left, this is the toppling of the statue of the white slave trader William Colston I mentioned earlier on. Again, I think in truth that though slavery and much of the empire is now defunct, the symbols and therefore mindsets are very much intact. And I think that, that act itself. But what was interesting about that act, if you look at the images of the people who were actually involved in that, there's obviously black people there, but there were lots of white people there. And there was something really significant about this moment of white people standing on the front line, as it were. Again, if you go right down to the image at the bottom right there, you see an image of black people who died in the COVID crisis. These are health workers, these are doctors and nurses. There's been a massive disproportionate number of, the kind of figures are horrific. 50% of all deaths of healthcare workers have been black. And you've got 50% more chance of dying if you're from a BAME community as well. And again, there's a white guy there with holding up the banner Black Lives Matter. If we go to the bottom left there, this is some of you remember last year the Grenfell fire. Again, really important moment that was, because it, again, it was seen as there wasn't any individual that kind of killed and again, the majority of the people who died were from BAME communities, but it was something to do with the system. And the media reporting at the time initial was very unsympathetic, and again, the first call that went out from one of the residents was, "I can't breathe." So this, and again, the COVID, it's about breathing. So there's something about breathing and not being allowed to breathe. Just wanted to finish off with this, the link with I guess universities and again symbolism. If you look at the image at the bottom, this is the image of the crest of Imperial College, and in the kind of ribbon at the bottom, this is in Latin, but it literally means, in service of science and empire. So there's something linking the idea of empire, of imperialism, of science, and even the word itself, Imperial College, probably says everything that we need to say. So symbolism is important. It motivates people. What connects, I think, all of these images, the past and the present, if you like, is that these are profound acts of violence and dehumanization. And in some sense, against BAME communities, and in some sense, this is part of the story. It's not the whole story. There's also a story of resistance as well. I think, maybe it's in that resistance that some of the answers lie. Now, let's go on to the next slide. So decolonizing the university, it's a very big challenge. It's a profound challenge. It's more than symbolism, but a whole new paradigm, I think, for developing education for a post-colonial, if you like, a kind of denationalized world, a world that doesn't see the world, people as belonging to nations as such, or nation states, if you like. Decolonizing knowledge in universities involves a deep sense of recognition and of challenge to colonial forms of knowledge, pedagogical strategies, and research methodologies. And this is McLaughlin and Watman. I think, particularly around even the whole kind of the kind of approach towards research, the way things are problematized. I mentioned earlier how if we frame something as a problem, then that becomes seen differently. So immigration, for example, if we see immigration as a problem, then that leads to lots of other kind of subsidiary questions. But if we see immigration as natural, as humanity is humanity because of immigration, then it raises a different kind of way which frame these things. Yeah. Kendi Andrews has been in the media a lot recently, who's a professor of Black Studies at University of Central England, said something a few years ago. He says, the university is not racist. The university is racism. The university is the master's house. And what he was saying there was, in some senses, we as universities, as a sector, are probably one of the most culpable, although it appears like we are the most kind of civilized, as it were. But if you think about how the whole colonial project itself was justified through the white man's burden, through the idea of the civilizing project, yeah, and how the knowledge production process was critical for the justification of a lot of the things that were happening. Now, I don't think there's an end game to decolonisation, but we have to start somewhere. And now is a better moment if there ever was one. But before we can decolonize, we need to understand colonialism. Now, you could argue that the history of the world is a history of imperialism and colonialism, and that's true to some extent. Maybe that's part of human nature. I don't know. But what we have to realize is that the world as we experience it today has, very specific antecedents. It has very particular strategies, technologies that have led to the arrangements that we have today, and therefore, we can identify historical periods. And of course, our historical period really begins from 1492, and Columbus's kind of adventures to the West Indies. And that's a whole history in itself. But Edward Said, who is a great, is a hero of mine, wrote two really important books. He wrote many books, but two important. One was called Orientalism, and that was followed up by his book Culture and Imperialism. And if you want to read about the role of culture in imperialistic history, then this is a perfect starting point. But he says a number of important. He says no one today is purely one thing. Labels like Indian or woman or Muslim or American are not more than starting points, which if followed into actual experience for only a moment are quickly left behind. Imperialism consolidated the mixture of cultures and identities on a global scale. So that's the first point, that all the conversations that we have today about race, about ethnicity, about immigration, about gender, about class, cannot be separated from the colonial, the imperial project. But it's worse and most paradoxical gift was to allow people to believe that they were only mainly exclusively white or black or Western or Oriental. Yet just as human beings make their own history, they also make their cultures and ethnic identities. I think what he's saying is that we are all different. We are all kind of complex people. But somehow at another level, we see each other in these very simplistic terms, yeah? Black and white, Western, other. We might not say, we might not verbalize it, but in our kind of mindsets, this is how we kind of become positioned. So no one can deny the persisting continuities of long traditions, sustained habitations, national languages and cultural geographies. But there seems no reason except fear and prejudice to keep insisting on their separation and distinctiveness, as if that was all human life was about. Survival, in fact, is about the connections between things. But this also means not trying to rule others, not trying to classify them or put them into hierarchies. And so I guess that's, already we can see what the project of decolonization is. Stop ruling people, stop classifying people, and stop putting them in hierarchies. But the challenge is how we get there. I think to do that, we do need to rethink our conception of time and space. And Joseph M. Beby's work is really important here. He's a South African writer. He wrote a book called Decolonising the University. So it's an article. And he says we need to move from this notion of shallow time to deep time. If you look at those images on the right, there's one which is a colonial map of the world 1914, which say, much of the world as we knew it was shaped in the image of colonialism. And that image at the bottom is really important. That's the image of a very famous conference, the Berlin Conference in I think it was 1884, where literally the European colonialists, the Germans, the Dutch, the Portuguese, the British, said, why should we fight over territories when there's plenty for everybody? And Africa was becoming a conflict point. So they literally sat down and carved it up. And that's why you find a lot of the countries in Africa have these very straight lines, which are not natural. They don't follow any natural typographies or geography. They're simply lines. It was like cutting up a cake. So one piece became, the Congo, there was a kind of Belgium, and then somebody else became French and German, and then those European languages imposed on those cultures. And then we say, why are these Africans fighting each other? So actually, through divide and conquer, that was a colonial strategy. So this is basically an explanation of that. And But we do need to remind ourselves that human beings have a deep history, relationship and technology to the planet, which is often revealed by indigenous populations from whom we can learn a lot. And I think, I guess, one of the challenges of colonialism is decolonizing, is to think about the indigenous populations of these places. Now, they themselves have been radically transformed for the worse, but there are still those knowledges that are there that I think, part of the project is how can we learn from those cultures. Otherwise, all we've got is the knowledge of imperialism and colonialism, which is dressed up as Western Enlightenment and science and everything else. It's not to say that there isn't something useful in there, but how do we, as it were, escape the trap of the colonial mindset if we simply only use a colonial epistemology, if you like, to make sense of the world? So Mbebe talks about ending of a dual ontology based on the nature culture split and a shift to a object-oriented philosophy, a different way of thinking about the world, not thinking about things simply in binary oppositions. And the work of Sousa de Santa is really kind of helpful here. He wrote a book called Epistemologies of the South. And so here's the dominant Enlightenment conception of knowledge based on the Hegelian dialectic, which is based on a negation and a separation of belief from fact. I think the other problem with the Hegelian model, which is the one that we use in Western kind of universities, is that it kind of, as it were, sucks all of knowledge into one funnel, saying that this is true knowledge and everything else is just simply pre-knowledge, as it were, or kind of not rational in the sense that it hasn't produced through rational engagement. Well, de Sousa talks about ecologies of knowledge, confronting the logic of the monoculture of scientific knowledge and rigor by identifying other knowledges and criteria of rigor and validity in social practices pronounced non-existent, recognition of plural systems of knowledge that are alternative to modern science or that engage with it in new knowledge configurations. So this is probably the biggest challenge, I think, universities, because we are still very much into a particular kind of view of knowledge as being detached, as being, kind of through on a single track. And as I said, de Sousa talks about this as, so colonialism was about, genocide. It was about, we can see within indigenous people, the way in which, indigenous populations have been wiped out. If you look at, say, something like Australia, the Aboriginal population, 50% of all Aboriginal people have got some kind of mental health problems. Similar proportions are, locked up in prisons and things like that. So across the world, we've seen how indigenous populations have been wiped out. Diseases wiped out, whole nations in South America, and these were diseases that were brought by the European. But what de Sousa said is a colonial domination, oppression, and the relations between the colonized and the colonized became key to my understanding of the various forms of domination, because forms of domination never act as pure forms, but rather as a constellation of oppression. That is why my thinking has increasingly turned to epistemological issues, and these are issues around the theories of knowledge. That is an engagement with the ways of knowing from the perspectives of those who have systematically suffered the injustices, dominations, and oppressions caused by colonialism. So what he's saying is that what we really, if we want to move forward, we need to value the knowledge of those below, of indigenous people, of those who have suffered the most, and that's both within kind of indigenous populations, but also within our university today, and kind of co-creation is the buzzword that's around. That if we want to create a knowledge for a decolonized university, decolonized world, then we need to create knowledge together. Let me just move on now to whiteness, because that was the other kind of part of my talk is, what does this mean for white people really? Now, this is a really difficult concept. What is whiteness? We can't begin to talk about dislodging whiteness without thinking about what is it. Is it an ethnicity? Is it a color? Is it an absence of a color? Is it the norm? Yeah. What do we mean when we say white people? And when and how did white people become white people? And when does somebody cease to be white? And this image on the right hand side there, this is an image of an albino a young person from who's I think she's African American, but is she a white person? Are albinos white people? Because they're as white as you can be. So what is the relationship between whiteness and white privilege, and what is the relationship between whiteness, colonialism, and capitalism? These are kind of key questions for us to think about. So what does the literature tell us about whiteness? And Bell Hooks, in her work, Black Looks, she says, no analysis of racism is complete without studying the social dynamics surrounding whiteness. So we really need to know what this elusive thing is. It's not really about skin color, but as such, but symbolism underpinned by deep economic, political, ideological, institutional structures. That's really important because actually, if you look at white people, they all have different skin color, just like black people have a different skin color. In fact, I would probably suggest that no two human beings have the same skin color. Our tones are all different, yeah? And W. Du Bois, who wrote a book called The Souls of White Folks, a very famous African-American theorist, he's a philosopher. He said something, he says, whiteness is a false ideal that in addition to inflicting great suffering on the darker races, imprisons white people. So it's a kind of an imprisonment, really. And Bell Hooks talks about whiteness as a racist fantasy held in place by the power white people have historically assumed to, and I quote, control the black gaze. So in that sense, whiteness is a kind of a gaze on the other. It's an outward looking, and that's why there's no gaze on whiteness. The gaze is always from whiteness, yeah? And despite the fantasy of whiteness being invisible, or at most representing goodness, whiteness, quotes, makes its presence felt in black life most often as terrorizing imposition, a power that wounds, hurts, and tortures. And I suppose that was most powerfully and physically expressed in the execution of George Floyd, and very much there was the gaze on the black man there. So decolonizing, learning from the past, but developing creative futures. Frantz Fanon, who's a really crucial author, writer in understanding relations of colonialism, both kind of the kind of cultural and the psychological, really. And so he was a psychiatrist. He said, humanity expects other things from us than this grotesque and generally obscene emulation. If we want to transform Africa into a new Europe, America into a new Europe, then let us entrust the destinies of our countries to the European. They will do a better job than the best of us. But if we want humanity to take one step forward, if we want to take it to another level, then the one where Europe has placed it, then we must innovate. We must be pioneers. If we want to respond to the expectations of our peoples, we must look elsewhere besides Europe. Moreover, if we want to respond to the expectations of Europeans, we must not send them back a reflection, however ideal, of their society and their thought that periodically sickens even them. For Europe, for ourselves, and for humanity, comrades, we must make a new start, develop a new way of thinking, and endeavor to create a new man. What Fanon in fact is saying here is that decolonization isn't going back to some prehistory, some kind of period in history where everything was okay, a kind of a Shangri-La. He's saying actually what we need to do is move forward. And in fact, he's getting us to reimagine and re-envisage what humanity might be, a kind of common humanity as we move forward. But it said it cannot be built on the kind of caricatures of humanity that European civilization, inverted commas, has given us in terms of Europe and the other, white and the white other. So what's stopping us from moving forward? I think that there are a number of factors in the present moment. There's a deepening of the economic crisis. We're already seeing unemployment levels going to be rising. And we know in history that when we've had huge levels of economic crisis, then that's emboldened fascists, it's emboldened extremists and nationalism. We are seeing the rise of nationalist politics across the world. And so, and prejudice, and there's lots of research in that. So I think that's a real threat to us at the moment. Destabilization of universities. I think we've loss of students, loss of closure of universities. But I think the government now seems to be abandoning universities and suggesting a university education isn't that valuable, and that's based on a very narrow view of what might be the role of education. I think there's a problem about elites seeking to secure their position by making symbolic gestures, maybe getting rid of the odd statue, but not really moving beyond that. Yeah, maybe the Black Lives Movement losing momentum. But I'd like to also make reference to the work of Paul Gilroy. He says there's a kind of a post-colonial melancholia that particularly, I suppose we're talking from a British perspective, the English suffer, and that image really kind of is trying to depict that. And this is where Gilroy says historically there have been periods, periodic crises. So this crisis that we're facing at the moment on race, happens every 10 years, maybe. We can talk about Stephen Lawrence, can talk about, in 1981, there were riots, almost every 10 years, Notting Hill. And what Gilroy says is that historically, as I say, we have these crises. Black communities take a stance, and then white elites, all those who are in control of institutional power, go through a moment of guilt. But then just at the point, it's a bit like at the point of jumping, as it were, over the cliff, like a bungee jump, they just can't contemplate, and they'll pull back. Yeah, it's this sense that you cannot contemplate an existential death, because in some senses, if we are to decolonize, then all of us have got to face some kind of existential death, because racism has positioned us in those kind of opposites. So just to last couple of slides, and then we can have a discussion. So we need to move from what I call this state of white awareness. I think my sense with a lot of colleagues, a lot of people in universities, they are definitely aware of racism. That there might be some kind of BNP types, these EDL types, but most people I meet in universities are, of course, nice people, and they find prejudiced behavior abhorrent. Yeah. So this is on the left-hand column. This is basically psychologizing everything. It's saying, well, if we can, as it were, deal with the cognitive distortions in our heads that cause unconscious bias, then we can solve the problem. So there's a desire to engage with Black issues and people, but only in limited spaces, maybe on committees, on training events. When you're getting paid for it, then you can be anti-racist. But when you're not getting paid for it, then you slip back into your own kind of comfortable space. So, as I say, some of that motivation might be because people feel guilty of the history of racism, maybe a desire to make amends. So these are noble reasons. I'm not saying they're not. A white privilege is recognized and becomes a source of shame and embarrassment. Most activity, however, is restricted to self-development and the deployment of politically correct language. And the onus seems to be on white people to overcome their unconscious bias. And if that happens, then all of the problems will be solved. Now, this is not a bad place to be, but if you stay at that position, I think that it becomes problematic as well. And in fact, it can become a kind of a self-indulgence. And some writers have said that it becomes, where the oppressor almost becomes a victim. Or this endless kind of desire to eradicate yourself of racism. I think a more useful position is what some people are talking about, white allyship. I think that's a more active position. And this is these pictures there. I think it's symbolized in some of that taking the knee. I think it's also that poster there, I see you, I hear you, I stand with you. So it's moving beyond the psychological, as it were, and it's moving into the political space, which is about struggling with power. So here, the perspective is racism is a complex interaction between structural, ideological, institutional, and behavioral processes. Now, the difference is in the previous kind of position is it's almost all understood as behavioral, but it can be overcome. It's not that the world is so kind of unequal that somehow we can't do anything. But it's characterized by a desire to take responsibility for change. And that's really important, which is not restricted to behavior. It's the focus on the paradigm shift, which we touched on earlier on, and concrete interventions and dynamic and creative solutions. Again, this is something that I take from Fanon's work, that we've got to be creative to make a new world. And co-creation is really important. Indigenous knowledge, the experiences of people who've lived that experience, and wisdom as well. A rejection of deficit models, an absolute rejection of any idea that somehow human beings are biologically inferior or superior. I think these are tropes, these are ideas from scientific racism, which were absolutely central to colonialism. It's a sharing of power, privilege, risk, and vulnerability. I think this is probably one of the most challenging aspects in how do white people share vulnerability, privilege, and risk. And it means actively divesting from history's systems and structures that reproduce racism. the active divestment of that. You become an activist, as it were. And I think that was so beautifully captured in the kind of trashing of the William Colston statue. And the onus is on white people to build sustained partnerships with Black people. That's really important. It's about partnership working together. So just to conclude then, sometimes progress is incremental and sometimes it's discontinuous, and we need to embrace both. But in the present moment, I think that we need to be bold and radical. I think it was Marx that said, all that's solid melts into air. I think there is this. I think we are in a moment where all that solid melts into air. That everything that we knew to be truth, as it were, to be. I mean, just look at these kind of Zoom conferences that we're doing. A few months ago, that was seen to be a niche activity, and now it's become almost an essential activity. So that just proves that things are possible. If there's a kind of will there, and maybe there needs to be a structural kind of reason for that as well. The twin crisis of COVID and Black Lives Matters offers a possibility, it's a kind of a crack has opened, a big crack has opened for us to work in that crack. But we need to slay quite a few sacred cows, and some are being slayed already. And we need to dislodge this Eurocentric kind of view of the world that continues to promote a destructive view of the world and its people. We need to find ways of seeing the non-European other, not as a threat, or as an inferior, but as a thinking, knowledge-producing subject. I think that's really important, that we don't see Black people as possessing deficits or as harbingers of cultural pathology, which is the way in which it's been done. Universities, we are all different. We all have our unique set of circumstances and contexts, and how this project unravels will have its differences. So decolonisation of universities in Oxford will be different to Delhi, Johannesburg, to Coventry or Bournemouth or anywhere else. We need to connect the decolonising project, colonising of the curriculum, with other intimately related issues around social, economic and environmental justice, rather than that the new arms race for global dominance that seems to be driving the development of universities. So I think we need to abandon a kind of neoliberal logic, which is how can we become the best universities in the world, to an idea, how can all universities be the best universities in the world? And we need to avoid tokenism as well, which means such things as internationalization are not simply a new form of colonial expropriation, which we know in a lot of universities they are, or cultural assimilation, or mechanisms for transnational elites, but are genuine attempts to facilitate the exchange of skills, knowledge and wisdom in service of humanity and the planet. And I'll stop there. So I don't know if I may have gone over, but I'm going to stop there, stop sharing, and I'm going to hand back over to you, John.
Thank you so much, Gernot. We have some questions coming in. I think we'll get started in case we get quite a few questions. So first of all, I think relating to your first slides on symbolism, you mentioned the Imperial College crest and name. What would you suggest to do? What if you worked at Imperial, what would you suggest they do to remove colonial associations?
Well, I mean, let me just read what the I won't give you an answer. I'll let the Vice Chancellor of Imperial College, who actually did. I mean, Imperial have now removed that. Yeah. So this is what. So they decided to drop it after 112 years. And Professor Alice Gast, who is the Vice Chancellor, says, I'm quoting her, "We know that this motto is a reminder of a historical legacy that is rooted in colonial power and oppression. We choose not to deny that history, but not to be defined by it either." And so what she was saying is that we won't be defined by that, and we won't deny that history happened. And she goes on to talk about universities have got to really take responsibility and take ownership. And I think some vice chancellors have been much more bold at that than others. I'll leave it there. And I won't mention where I position our vice chancellor.
And on the subjects of white senior leaders, how do you think white senior leaders can get the balance right between supporting and speaking out versus overstepping the mark and, I suppose, becoming the voice?
if you do a token gesture, then people will realize that they'll see that as an empty gesture. But if we go back to George Floyd, and what was really interesting is that there were some police forces, I can't remember which ones, I think it was the Atlanta one and some in California, where the police officers and the chiefs didn't go out to, as it were, to police the demonstrators, which was happening in some other places, and violence was erupting, but went out and joined the demonstrators. That, you know, and some of them took the knee, but then walked with the demonstrators, yeah, and said, you know, we do not deny this. So I think that's the starting point, is for vice chancellors to state openly and honestly that you know, universities. I mean, Mary Wollstonecraft, in a period previously when women were excluded from universities, when she wrote her famous treatise on the rights of women, said that the universities had, I think she called them dens of corruption and thieves, yeah, and men. So I'm not going to suggest that we use that language, but I think we have to acknowledge, you know, when you have a whole kind of senior management structure is almost all white and male, in some universities that's the case, then that's indefensible. And I think that, you know, a brave vice chancellor would say, this is indefensible. I will set myself a 3-year target, and if nothing happens, then I will fall on my sword. I think it's come to the point where resignation is the most dignified thing to do, and acceptance of failure. Because if it was, say if a vice chancellor, I don't know, initiated a project to build a campus somewhere, and there was a huge loss, and it was a foolish error, that vice chancellor would probably get sacked. So, but you know, we're talking about lives and racism. I think that that should be a sackable offence. You know, if you fail to address institutional racism, then that should be a sackable offence.
And I think there's learning for all of us there, particular white senior leaders within the students' union movement who might have an all-white senior leadership team as well. Yeah, I mean, you know, I think it's saying, look, I can't do the job, yeah? I need to get out of the, and that's part of white allyship, you know, I was saying divesting in power, divesting. You know, if you want to make space for others to be at the top table, then you have to move aside sometimes. The same things with gender, you know, and getting more women involved and you know, disabled people as well. So it's not just exclusive. That's what inclusion isn't just talking about inclusion. Inclusion is actually, you know, allowing people power. We have someone who is very interested in the term whiteness. And in regards to white privilege, what do you think about the notion of white passing and the privilege associated with it? Do you think it's a useful concept or harmful? And how can it relate with the responsibility for white passing folk to use that privilege, understanding many would experience different racist incidents related to colorism? I mean, I haven't really heard of the word white passing, so I can't really comment on that. It'd be useful maybe for that person to give us some definitions, or maybe somebody else could answer that question. So if anybody out there has some thoughts about that question, about this concept of white passing, I think it'd be useful to get that into the kind of mix, really. I haven't come across it yet. I don't know if you've come across it, John. No, but on that, on the subject of labels, I think one controversial issue we're all dealing with at the moment is the term BAME itself, and black and politically black. What's your views on the term BAME? Do you think it's useful as a label? Do you think it negates individual prejudices that will be happening to black people? Yeah. I wrote a piece a few years ago which was called Developing a Post-Racial University. I think call it post-racial pedagogy. And I was trying to grapple with some of these problems. Audre Lorde says that you can't dismantle the master's house with the master's tools, yeah? And some of these concepts, these labels themselves are the master's tools, yeah? In fact, the label of whiteness and blackness, of any attempt to, as it were, to reduce people who are complex human beings and put a label on them, but that label is seen in opposition to something, yeah? So it becomes a simplification of reality, are problematic. But but we have another problem, is that unless we can count, as it were, discrimination, unless we can account for discrimination, then how do you then engage in a discussion around structural inequality? If you go to France, for example, in France, it's against the law to
categorize people in terms of ethnicity or race. Yeah. So they have no ethnic monitoring whatsoever in France. They see that as racist. They will say, in fact, colleagues who say to me, these labels that you aren't they racist? But from their perspective, they believe in this kind of Republican ideal of, liberty and equality and fraternity. But the criticisms of France is that because of that, racism is masked and that, it goes unaccounted for. So I don't know. It's a paradox. Wittgenstein, who some of you will know as a philosopher of language, said something really interesting. He said that, in a sense, the limits of language are the limits of human knowing. And these terms called BAME, the fact that we keep changing them every so often just proves that they're limited, yeah? But also proves that maybe they are a political struggle. So, yeah, I mean, I like to call myself black, not because there's anything inherently black about me, but because I get positioned as the non-white other, yeah? But ultimately, these are problematic concepts. But if anybody can come up with a better way of accounting for racism, then let's have it,
I think then also we have issues where when you start talking about minorities, when in actual fact, what we're talking about is the global majority.
Absolutely, yeah, the global majority. And maybe that's what we should be talking about is, the rights for the global majority.
We have another question with someone who would like to ask you specific questions. Are you happy for your email address to be passed on?
Oh, yeah, definitely. I mean, you can just Google me or get me on Twitter or something, yeah.
Yeah. And we also have an explanation for the white passing, which is the idea of a person of color who can pass as white. So it's about, is that
well, let me tell you a story, John.
Privilege that gives you understanding, or is it inherently problematic?
Well, if you look at some of the work of black people like Frantz Fanon and the impact of colonialism, actually I won't say most, but a lot of black people desire to be white. Why wouldn't you? If white is represented as everything that one might dream of being beautiful. And that's why we have in India, for example, an absolute obsession with whiteness. Skin lightening creams are big business in India. And I myself, when as a young lad growing up in Bradford in a racist environment, tried to associate with white friends, tried to almost make myself other to my own kind of community and try to pass as maybe not quite black, but having a slightly fairer skin. So there's a lot of that, so people, and you can understand why people might want to position themselves there, but it's not a tenable position because you will still be positioned as the other because of the structural factors.
And the final question we have for you, Gurnham, from Aisha: how do you challenge the notion of a few individuals from minority groups being used to continuously act as the representative voice at all levels within the university? Very good question.
Yeah, well, this is actually, the antecedent of this is the colonial project. Yeah, one of the strategies that the East India Company had. I mean, if you read Dalrymple's book on the East India Company, it was just a small bunch, maybe about a couple of thousand at the maximum of administrators who were running this huge country. And the strategy they were using was they would go and bring me your leader. This notion of go to the chief, go to the person who can speak for the community. Yeah. And then they would literally use all kinds of methods, bribery, corruption, patronage, yeah, to have them on your side. And then they could say, look, we are consulting the natives and the natives want to be enslaved because your leader says so. Now, I'm not suggesting that all people who speak for minority communities are necessarily, kind of going to be colluding with oppression. But that's the danger when you invest in single people as being the voice. I mean, we wouldn't say that Boris Johnson is the voice of white people, would we? Or of white middle-class people, or that the Archbishop of Canterbury represents the voice. These are absurd suggestions. So why should we do the same when it's from minority communities? Why should one black person who might actually be quite an obnoxious individual be seen to be representing black people? Yeah, and in fact, a lot of black feminists have said that, often these people who represent minority communities tend to be men who have quite problematic attitudes towards gender anyway. So no, I think you need to connect with the grassroots.
Thank you so much, Gurnham, for your time, for your session. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. Plenty more coming up this afternoon. We have networking for small and specialist student unions. We have a session on HR in the modern times and how you recruit and induct remotely. Sessions there. We've got sessions on transforming universities using data. We've got sessions on leading the team back from furlough. There's all sorts of things. So please do check the schedule, as sessions do have a habit of moving around. People are thanking you for your talk, Gurnham. I've put your email address into the chat if anyone wants to contact you directly, and we will put a recording of this session with the slides up on the website in half an hour or so. But massive thank you to Gurnham, a massive thank you to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you.
Thank you very much, yeah.